Hello critics, hello theorists. James Crane here. First, on behalf of the Critical Theory Working Group, I want to thank everyone who made it out to the live session of our post-release debriefing on January 31st for the CTWG Journal, Margin Notes Volume 1, Kernels of Early Critical Theory. It's not easy to coordinate a schedule that works for the whole group when no more than 2 members are in any one time zone in the US, not to mention the international time differences, and when everyone's work schedule is a reflection of the general conditions of underpaid overwork and ongoing underemployment we know many of you are subject to as well. Still, a few of you managed to join in from your work and on your commute, and we are immensely grateful to know there are so many freaks out there who would choose to spend a Friday afternoon discussing the finer points of early critical theory with us. Because of some technical difficulties on our end and physical, I'd also contracted norovirus earlier that morning after eating a bad Greek salad, we don't have a recording of the meeting. So we've each recorded explainers for the articles we wrote for Margin Notes Volume 1 instead. We're grateful for your patience as we figure out the technical side of things, which we expect to have ironed out by our forthcoming reading group session, which is scheduled to begin later this month. Specifically on the 22nd, you can sign up through our website, where you'll find a schedule of the meetings and an Eventbrite link. Once you've signed up, you'll also receive a link to an optional Discord server as well. And if you want, you can use that to keep the conversation going after the meetings end. At the end of the day, this is a labor of love for us, and we never really expected to make any money off of it. So we want to thank everyone who subscribed to our Patreon as a paying patron for any length of time. Your contributions are the only reason we've been able to pay members of the editorial board for essential behind-the-scenes work, like setting up the website and editing the recordings. I want to extend a special thanks to our webmaster Anatara and our producer Ray, as well as J.E. Moraine, who will be editing this special episode. As for Margin Notes Volume 1, at nearly 300 pages, it is a monster, and it's the crystallization of a year's worth of discussions and revisions. In the following explainers, each author will introduce their own essay by explaining their motivations, presenting the basic idea that animates it, and reflect on their own takeaways from the whole process. We hope these explainers will give readers who've downloaded the PDF, but who've been waiting for a good reason to dig in, the tools and motivation they need to do so. As for the sequence, our rogues gallery of authors will present in the order their essays appear in the volume itself. First, Mac, with Essence in the Archaic, notes towards a historical materialist account of the concept of essence. Second, Samuel J. Thomas, with On the Falsity of Prevailing Ideas, the concept of ideology in early critical theory. Third, J.E. Moraine, with Analytic Social Psychology as critical social theory. Fourth, Esther, with Horkheimer's Materialism versus Morals and Metaphysics, its Limitations and Possibilities. And fifth, Zach, with On the Social Situation of Adorno's Critical Music Theory. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions or comments, or just want to talk critical theory with us, feel free to bother us on any social media platform. Thanks to our social media czar, Samuel J. Thomas, I believe we're on everything except for TikTok. Or you can send an email to our Gmail address, crittheoryworkgroup@gmail.com. And instead of repeating that, I will just direct you to our website where you can find all of our contact information that we hope you use. Before passing the mic to Mac, I want to try to present the basic idea of the preface I wrote for the first volume of Margin Notes, but from a different angle, in the interest of explaining why I think critical theory is worth reading, not just despite, but also because of how much it demands, and that it does so as a conceptual articulation of all the demands which make it so damn hard to do critical theory in the first place. The orienting idea of early critical theory, its theoretical and practical horizon, its criterion of judgment, is the idea of classless society. However, this idea rarely appears so explicitly in their published texts of the 30s and 40s. In their unpublished texts of the time, however, the idea of classless society is omnipresent, and so is their conviction that, if it is presented carefully enough, it could even seem self-evidently true to their readers. This enables us to read the dialectic of enlightenment differently, for instance. since the imaginary witness they speak of at the end of the book in a very infamous passage is in fact just the recipient of an open secret. The book is littered with phrases like everyone knows and everyone has a dim inkling and so on. In the conclusion to the Schema of Mass Culture, which was originally intended to be the concluding supplement to the culture industry chapter, Adorno writes, "The neon signs which hang over our cities and outshine the natural light of the night with their own are comets presaging the natural disaster of society, its frozen death. Yet they do not come from the sky, they are controlled from the earth. It depends upon human beings themselves whether they will extinguish these lights and awake from a nightmare which only threatens to become actual as long as men believe in it." As other interpreters have noted, each of the core chapters of the Dialectic of Enlightenment ends with an image of waking up from a dream, returning to consciousness, of coming into possession of one's powers. In the ISR's 1942 seminars on need, from which Adorno's famous theses on need originate, Horkheimer explains, "The idea of a classless society didn't just happen to arise in Marx's head, but is born within every action oriented towards the establishment of a human society. The domination is compelled to give the masses something like culture. This indicates utopia still lives in their hearts. That culture has always been needed makes it evident that the masses themselves have an intimation of the right classless society. The idea of classless society is not an a priori, neither a necessary and apodictic one, nor an arbitrary and heuristic one, but is the reflective form given to demands we already make in this world for another. Take, for instance, the difference between a collector's need for gramophone records and a hungry child's need for milk. As Horkheimer writes, in the same instant in which so many human beings starve, in which the world is in danger of transforming into one vast machine of terror, one cannot speak of the cultural value of gramophone records alone. What is different about the need of the hungry child, however, Horkheimer writes in his thesis on the problem of need, is that it contains the demand for a society so transformed that no one is forced to make a dichotomy between music and milk, between so-called ideal and so-called material needs. Adorno affirms in reply, so long as the question is more milk or less milk and more gramophone records, one must decide in favor of milk. The most famous formulation of this thought is found in Adorno's Minima Moralia. There is tenderness only in the coarsest demand, that no one shall go hungry anymore. At its best, Horkheimer concludes, culture therefore expresses an indictment of the conditions under which culture has been offered to the exclusion of milk. Quote, "Whatever I find to be affirmative in culture relates to classless society. The rest falls to pieces in one's hands as a lie." End quote. This is a singular demonstration of the method of really critical theory, which at one point they call reverse induction, the discovery of the universal through immersion in the particular. Theoretical reflection on the implications of the demand that a hungry child not go without milk simultaneously articulates a comprehensive judgment of the existing world and a determinate indication towards a better one. As Horkheimer concludes in the third of his theses on need, the effort to fulfill even the most basic of needs is largely illusory if it is linked to the maintenance of conditions of catastrophe, and the need to end these catastrophes is no more secondary, tertiary, no more refined, no more spiritual than any of the coarsest of natural necessities. Because our concepts are forms which reflect unsatisfied needs and uncultivated powers of human beings, they are necessarily as self-indicting as culture is under class domination. Consciousness of this, when integrated as a moment into our concepts themselves, gives our concepts a critical edge. With this, I'll give the floor to Mac, who's taken up the task Adorno called the anamnesis of the Genesis for one of the most abstract concepts in the history of philosophy, that of essence, by restoring it to the social antagonisms which afforded its conceivers the tranquility of their contemplations.
Like with most of the pieces we're talking about today, I started writing my article after our fall 2023 reading group, in which I led a session on Marcuse's essay, The Concept of Essence. There was something I found extremely compelling about that essay, and its attempt to both give a historical materialist account of the history of the concept and develop a Marxist doctrine of essence for its own time. At the same time, I felt like something about it didn't quite add up. I was especially uneasy about his analysis of the ancient Greek emergence of the concept of essence, which seemed like it grounded the rest of his historical narrative while, at the same time, being particularly underdeveloped and schematic, especially in terms of relating the concept to the historical conditions of ancient Greece. In writing my own essay, I tried to focus in on the same era and its concrete historical conditions in order to give a proper historical materialist account of it, and to reevaluate the theoretical and practical significance of the concept of essence on the basis of that account. Additionally, since finishing the essay, I've become increasingly convinced that analyzing the historical conditions and functions of the concept of essence is critical for understanding and evaluating Marx's own analysis in Capital, in which the distinction between essence and appearance is central. As a result of my research, I came to the conclusion that the emergence of the concept of essence in ancient Greece, which took the form of the concept of abstract substance around which early pre-Socratic thought revolved, was part of an aristocratic attempt to reconfigure the ideological conditions of their rule in the face of an extended crisis produced by the monetization of their social formations and the consolidation of new relations of exploitation centered around slavery. I argue that it was the displacement of the determinations of the money form, especially unity, universality, and abstraction, from a social to a metaphysical register that allowed them to do so, providing a reality schema around which they could orient that reconfiguration and legitimize their place in the emerging relations of exploitation. The centrality of money and the facilitation of class rule in the emergence of the concept of essence in ancient Greece has made the question of its usefulness for a contemporary revolutionary project seem even more pressing to me. Can we use the concept of essence towards the overthrow of existing society and its class relations, or does its conceptual function remain caught up in the reproduction of what is? Does the connection between essence and money mean that the analysis of essence on which the Marxist critique of political economy rests assumes from the beginning what it intends to explain? I think the work I've done in this essay helps delineate a field for further inquiry in which those questions can be answered, even if it doesn't allow us to answer them yet. I hope my readers agree, or at least found it interesting and provocative as an exercise in historical reconstruction.
Like many Marxists, I've used the term ideology often for many years. I did this even though I had a foggy notion of what the term meant. This changed in 2023 when I came across the late Robert Paul Wolff's lectures on ideology. The first couple of these cover the works of Karl Mannheim. Wolff's quick wit reignited my interest in ideology, so I decided to study the topic again in earnest. When I mentioned this to the Critical Theory Working Group, Herr Krahn introduced me to Horkheimer's critique of Mannheim. Crane motivated me to present Horkheimer's piece on Mannheim during our winter 2023 sessions. After that, I was off to the races. The aim of my piece is to develop a critical theory of ideology which lacks the faults of Mannheim's system. I do not have time to elaborate on Mannheim's sociology of knowledge, as he calls it. I can only develop the critical theory of ideology itself. To do this, we need three things. First, we need a method to guide us. Second, we need an Ideologie Theorie, or theory of ideology, which describes its role in society. Third, we need an Ideologie Kritik, or critique of ideology, which shows its obfuscatory role. As this account of ideology is both a theory and a critique, I call it a critical theory of ideology. The key methodological insight is that thought is not autonomous in Kant's sense. Intellectuals exist in the real world and are not above its influence. As Marx notes in the 1859 preface, the ideological superstructure rests on the economic base. This means that we should not treat thought in isolation. Rather, we must look at the socio-economic relations that give rise to thought. Marx's dialectical method in the introduction of the Grundrisse is also insightful. That is, we must move from concrete to abstract, then back to concrete. Abstract forms of thought gain conceptual validity based on material social relations. Only this dialectical method can explain the relationship between ideology and material relations. Individualistic models cannot account for the social totality. This is because they reduce the individual to an atom. By contrast, top-down models cannot account for the interplay between individual and group. A second methodological point is that capitalism makes thought non-autonomous. Capitalist social relations influence all type of academic inquiry. The division of academic labor leads to reified consciousness in the ivory tower. Here I coined the term double determination. By this, I mean that the social totality determines both the object of academic analysis and the aim of the researcher. Academics must accept their working conditions without questioning their social role. Double determination leads to buck passing on matters of fact and fragmentary conceptions of the social totality. This, in turn, is why extant theories of ideology are lacking. On the theoretical side of ideology, Horkheimer stresses 2 points. First, ideology is the result of a material social process. Second, it plays a functional role in class struggle. Ideology's function is hiding the immanent contradictions of society. This does not mean that ideologues are deceitful. Many ideological beliefs are valid in themselves, but they still obscure the real relations that govern society. For instance, bourgeois thinkers condemn egoistic behavior time and again. Yet they do so at the exact moment where an economic system based on egoism takes root. Since material relations undergird ideology, one cannot dispel it through theoretical criticism alone. And when capitalist ideologies break down, cruelty steps in to protect them and their material base. On the critique of ideology, we must answer why thought in capitalism turns into ideology. Often, thinkers are unaware that their thought has become ideological. So vulgar Marxist conspiracism is false, as it relies on the great man theory of history. The true answer comes in 2 parts. The philosophical answer is that bourgeois thought stopped criticism after it supplanted scholasticism. The material answer is that the subordination of academia to capital instrumentalizes reason. As noted earlier, instrumentalization of reason makes thought fall prey to double determination. This means that such thought cannot account for the social totality. As such, the thought produced is ideological. The falsehood of ideology contrasts with the truth of totality. There is, of course, more in the paper, but circumstances force me to conclude here.
Writing about Fromm sort of fell into my lap. I started this project in the winter of 2023. Everyone else in CTWG had already claimed the major figures of the Frankfurt School like Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse, so I took it upon myself to look into Fromm. I read his first essay for the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, entitled The Method and Function of an Analytic Social Psychology, and was surprised by how much it sounded like Deleuze and Guattari's anti-Oedipus at points. That similarity alone convinced me that Fromm was worth taking seriously, and that's sort of a meta takeaway that I want to communicate. Fromm is worth taking seriously, and critical theory cannot be understood without taking account of his contributions to it. I subtitled my essay, A Reconstruction of Erich Fromm's Early Work, because I came to think that Fromm's early work formed a truly cohesive and original theory, a foundation stone for both his own later work and the collective enterprise of the Frankfurt School. And I actually ended up writing 2 essays about Fromm. The other one, which is about his entire life work in psychoanalysis, is just being published in issue 5 of Parapraxis, which is a psychoanalysis magazine. So much for my motivation. What theoretical takeaways did I arrive at through this project? The main one that I want to get across concerns Fromm's approach to the classic Marxist idea of base and superstructure, and how Fromm approached this central problem of historical materialism. In his 1930s essays, Fromm makes bold statements like, quote, "The realm of human drives is a natural force which, like other natural forces, is an immediate part of the substructure of the social process," unquote. Or, quote, "The libidinal strivings of human beings are among the social, productive forces in society," unquote. For reference, Deleuze and Guattari wrote in Anti-Oedipus that, quote, "Desire is part of the economic infrastructure," a statement which is almost identical to Fromm's. This might sound reductive, but I came to think that Fromm's thesis is really that the distinctively psychological dimension of human existence has its own relative autonomy and special effectivity vis-a-vis the base and superstructure, to explain things using a more Althusserian idiom. Every society has its own distinctive libidinal structure, as Fromm says. In my essay, I tried to reconstruct his sophisticated account of that structure, which he described using psychoanalysis, as well as how it forms a crucial part of the social process, how it is reproduced by the agency of the family, and how it influences things like social change. I summarized one of his core principles with the proposition that, quote, functionalism is not a presupposition of the social process, but a result of it. This point is important because Fromm's critical and dialectical functionalism makes space for agency. The principle is a generalization of his thesis that the socially repressive functionalization of human drives can break down and libidinal energies can, quote, cease to be cement and turn into dynamite. Even something like the family, which Fromm clearly saw as a conservative institution, had potential for social explosivity via the power of unconditional, maternal love. Hatred had the power to create either real social revolution or self-defeating authoritarian rebelliousness. In general, Fromm extended the analysis of ambivalence that Freud introduced to individual psychoanalysis to the social field, and ultimately he created a solid theoretical foundation for his analytical social psychology.
So this is the presentation of my article on Horkheimer, Materialism versus Morals, and Metaphysics, Its Limitations and Possibilities. My interest in morality, or the ethical field, starts with Hegel's critique of Kant's morals in his short treatise on ethics, titled Natural Law, the Scientific Ways of Treating Natural Law, Its Place in Moral Philosophy, and Its Relation to the Positive Science of Law. And what Hegel's core discussion there brought me to think that this was a key conceptual material to investigate when looking at many issues related to the ethos sustaining laws' interactions and materialization within the laws of the market, the state, and how it reflected in the formation of the legal subject in its relation to corporations, but also within governments such as democratic constitutions where self-destructive democratic laws can be logically instituted in order to effectively achieve its own demise. For me, all those issues are directly connected to the study of fascism's intrinsic production and reproduction by capitalism, including the development of National Socialism and fascism before, and then its renaming, that for me is a renaming or reconceptualization after the Second World War, and the ethos of the legal national and international laws, including the military versus the other laws that can apply also via secret agencies. The laws, black holes, no? Voids, borders, all that cosmology. The Hegelian notion at some point might indicate that after the Enlightenment, French or German, any of those, we have all become active judges, so that where consciousness and self-consciousness in its perception of truth always engage us with judgmental activities. At the same time, Hegel displaces the critical philosophy, as he named the Kantian morality, as ineffective or too rigid, and opens up, quite possibly, the path for thinkers like Marx to tackle morals and the ethical aspect of law in its aim, even if displaying a need to self-deter from a very specific bourgeois moralizing. However, the use of ethics and the denying of morals brought about certain contradictions of form and content, subject and object for the Marxist critical theorist. My questions about materialism's separation from morals that expands to ethics are related to its postmodern departure. They are interested in the critique of such, initiated by Gillian Rose, with relation to the neo-Kantian influence of the early sociology and that she perceives in the work in the Frankfurt School in general, and for this article on Max Horkheimer in particular. The non-debated issue of how more Kantian or less Hegelian one is, albeit if unaware. For the article, I wanted to do a close reading of some of the works produced by Horkheimer for understanding, assessing from today's perspective the author thoughts at the times, in the times that the texts were written, in the 30s in the case, and the Marxist sociology as the project of the early Frankfurt School, specifically because of the intense fascist climate they had to put up with and try to decipher and critique at the time. A key question to rethink was that of the critique of the value judgment, especially because prima facie it appears as a necessary tool to argue against all of those practices by which capitalism subjugates all of those it needs, either to repress or expressly eliminate. One need to be involved in judgments of evaluation or valuation. Understanding that morals are bound by another problem, which will be reification and ideology in its configurations. What I did was to bring in the main issue about which I have a series of concerns, as are the notion of the moral understood as ethics or ethical life, which is the Hegelian version, and place the question of morals related to the neoliberal and moral practice obsessed with freedom and its historical violent fascist alliances versus the critique they deploy against the moralist socialist ethos. I had recently read Jessica White's work, The Morals of the Market, and was interested in reading what Horkheimer had to say against morals and metaphysics in his critical methodology and exposition in defense of materialism. I also used some fragments of a very dense text against socialism by Ludwig von Mises, one of the fathers of the Austrian neoliberal school. Quite possibly, and now in retrospective, I believe so, the whole interest in value judgment and validity owes to my readings of Gillian Rose, Hegel contra Sociology, and the Melancholy Science, to want to be able to fully grasp what was at stake in the various interpretations and validations of the sociology and the sociologists she brings to her comment related to value and validity, and to disentangle the series of issues about the legacy of a post-Kantian problem that the sociologists she brings out as having passed on to Adorno almost without him being aware. My belief is that she hits a very important issue there, but that it needs more digging into the way that Hegel has been applied or understood, and also in the case of Kant's legacy.
My paper was initially supposed to focus on Adorno's first ZFS essay published in 1932 titled On the Social Situation of Music, since that essay is really Adorno's first comprehensive articulation of his musical Marxism and his musical theory of communism. In that essay, Adorno takes readers into the hidden abode of musical production and develops a dialectic of the musical material that reveals the social antinomies of composition in post-liberal capitalist society. And he does this explicitly for the sake of the goal of proletarian revolution. But in the 1962 book, Introduction to the Sociology of Music, Adorno largely affirms what he did in On the Social Situation of Music in 1932, while also indicating that he has refused to give permission for the essay's republication because it fails to adequately account for the social mediation of musical spontaneity. So despite my initial desire to limit the scope, I realized that this paper is part of a larger book project whose aim is to re-articulate Adorno's critical theory of society from the perspective of his early account of music's social situation and his late critique of it, since it is precisely in this lifelong trajectory that the full significance of Adorno's ideas becomes clear. What I mean is that the re-articulation of Adorno's critical theory from a musical standpoint clarifies the otherwise muted political content of his ideas. So in my essay, I try to spell out how Adorno's theory of the musical material and his later critique of it, which again form the crux of his account of the hidden abode of musical production, are a way of negotiating some of the thorniest problems of Marxism for the sake of a communist politics. Let me briefly clarify. Adorno deploys music not as a positive category, but as a critical one, just as the categories of political economy for Marx are critical rather than positive. That's what distinguishes Marx from Hegel, according to Adorno, that even the primacy of production is not rendered as if it could simply act as a category within a non-capitalist society. So what does it mean to say that Adorno treats music as a critical category? When Adorno leads readers into the hidden abode of musical production and reveals the compositional model at its core, he's attempting to show us that it is impossible for any musical phenomenon to be right in a wrong world, since the problems that plague musical phenomena are problems of the social totality. The answer, according to Adorno, is not to fix music or musical consciousness, but to abolish the necessity of privation at the heart of the accumulation of capital. Only that would do justice to music's promise of happiness, Adorno argues. Quote, what is unattainable for music of the utmost integrity might solely be hoped for from a better organized society, not from customer service. The end of music as an ideology will have to await the end of antagonistic society, end quote. But if everything we do musically is an expression of the antagonistic totality, and there's no outside the nexus of social guilt, is all music just false consciousness without any truth content? Adorno suggests that such a claim would only redouble the falsity of the whole. His position is that capitalism cuts rationalization short for the sake of reproducing class domination, and that a music that strives to escape universal practice does not likewise prematurely abandon rationalization or organization. When musical production follows rationalization past the point where it's usually cut off, music becomes something like critical theory. It becomes a critically self-reflexive artwork, where the binding of every detail into the semblance of an organic whole with its own internal necessity shows the whole is false. The genuine artwork, Adorno writes, reveals fulfillment in its brokenness. It reveals that capitalism is merely a negative totality. It reveals that greater integration means greater antagonism, that the whole is a parody of classless society. Another way Adorno puts this is that the artwork with genuine truth content, the aesthetic semblance that is more than semblance, the artwork that really does justice to its promise of happiness, shows that it's guilty. It shows that it is, in fact, part of the social world it opposes a priori. And it does this cryptogrammatically by giving voice to what rationalization mutilates, something that is not reducible to the economy of motivic unity, something enigmatic, something non-identical, something mimetic that reaches for the outside of the exchange principle insofar as it exists in itself and not merely in relation to the whole. Why does it communicate indirectly as a cryptogram? As Adorno says, the immediate cannot realize itself immediately in a world of universal mediation, which is to say that music that makes manifest its guilt has a genuine truth content insofar as it's marked by precisely what it seeks to escape. That is, insofar as it is hated and incomprehensible to all but those educated thanks to class privilege. Adorno is not advocating for a world where musical production is more like Schoenberg's free atonality. A capitalist future where everyone produces and appreciates avant-garde music could very well be less self-conscious of itself than one where it's mostly hated. Perhaps it would be something like Norway. Adorno is trying to clarify how music embodies the inexorable wrongness of capitalism inasmuch as hated and incomprehensible music speaks truth. And this clarification entails another, a political program, a glimpse of what is to be done. So in short, my paper tries to explain how the musical model Adorno offers, not only in the initial presentation of 1932, but in the critique of it 30 years later, becomes one, his way of putting forward a theory of spontaneity in the face of the inescapability of capitalist socialization. Two, his way of making manifest what is to be done in order to overcome the antinomies of wrong life. And three, his way of providing a pictureless picture of communism. In short, a form of life where organization and planning are not opposed to freedom. And with all this in mind, one can begin to see how the dialectic of the musical material, as a dialectic between identity and non-identity, between rationalization and mimesis, elucidates the political content of negative dialectics and the dialectic of enlightenment. Thank you.